LSD is derived from ergot, which is a mold that grows on wheat, on rye. It was originally developed by, or found by Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist with Sandoz, who was working with ergot, ergotamine, as a cure for headaches and for a whole range of other uses, and who ingested some of this by chance and felt quite strange and went home and experienced himself as being on the other side of the room. He came back the next day and tried another test and realized that he had come across a mind-altering substance. This was back in the late 40s. That was the original time of the development.
The history of mind-expanding substances is long and varied. The compounds have existed for centuries in many forms. They are now, just as they have always been, a subject of curiosity and controversy.
For example, there had been work with the mushrooms in Mexico, which has been called by a variety of names, including Tiaranacta, the flesh of the gods. These mushrooms were used for religious insights and ecstatic experiences by the Mexican Indians, put down by the Spanish when the Spanish came in, but continued to be used during the rainy season when the mushrooms grew. And people such as Gordon Wasson from the Morgan Guarantee Trust in New York and others had gone down to explore with these, along with the peyote rituals used by the peyote used by the Native American Church and so on. In other words, chemicals that had vegetables, plants that had altered states of consciousness had been used throughout history, actually.
Are all psychedelic experiences the same?
Well, I was a Jewish middle-class boy who was brought up to be a very high achiever, right? And I ended up as a professor at Harvard, which is the good thing for Jewish middle-class boys to do. And I thought I needed all that, you know, for my own identity, for my own acceptance of myself. And suddenly I began to see that each of these things were things that I had taken on like clothing, even my name, even the way I knew myself. All of these were, in a sense, acquired psychological clothing that I wore. And when I kept taking them away and taking one away, it's like taking a mask off and then another mask and then another mask. You're the lover, and then you're the scientist, and then you're the motorcycle driver, and then you're, you know, and you keep taking off one layer after another until you get back to the existence of what is, I guess, the essence in man, which has no identity. It doesn't have any unique qualities to you or to me, right? Now that's what you experience as unity with another person, because you realize the same thing is in you that's in me. Now, as you go to this next level, then, you start to merge with other people, so you get that feeling of the oneness, and this is exactly what Christ is talking about when he talks about the brotherhood of man, or Buddha was talking about, or any of the great mystics had exactly the same vision. And when you read them again, you say, boy, that's right, that's just what I experienced last Thursday night, or something like that, which is a very bizarre thing when you think about it, you see. Well, now you keep going one more level, and you move to the next stage, which involves seeing not only living things, but non-living things as the same. And what I mean by this is that you start to see everything in terms of energy patterns. Now, this is very much like Einstein's E equals mc squared. You're seeing the conversion of mass to energy. And this is a fascinating phenomenon, because instead of seeing things as solid objects, which we know in sophisticated scientific jargon they are not, we see them as process. It's just as if you see clouds.
These flights into the depths of the consciousness produce visions and hallucinations, and may transcend many other plateaus of the mind. For some, the reaction is peaceful. For others, very unpleasant. Is the reaction physiological or psychological, or does it involve something else? Something about which very little is known.
After our first year of research at Harvard, during which we really provided psilocybin to some 200 people from a variety of walks of life, to find out, well, here's what our problem was. When Tim came back from Mexico, he felt very strongly that the imposition of any model on how this should be used was premature. You see, the problem is when you find something new, you can say, well, it's very much like a this, and therefore we will use it the way we've always used this. Or you can say, well, really, what this should be used for is this, and your mind determines how it will be interpreted and used by society. Now, here you had, say, a mushroom that was used by one group for religious visions, for another for the wise men to have profound insights, for American psychiatrists to study people going crazy. Well, each of them had their model of how these materials should be used. And we are interested in not imposing a model too soon until we found out what the possibilities were. So under suitable safety conditions, we provided the opportunity for some 200 very varied types of people, from prison inmates to jazz musicians to philosophers, people like Huxley and Hurd and so on, to have this experience and give us reports back, naturalistic reports. The analysis of these reports showed us very clearly that the nature of the experience that you have with a psychedelic chemical is a function in large part of the set and the setting. That is, the set or expectation that the individual has of what is going to happen to him, and the setting or the environment in which he has the experience. And with a proper set, meaning a very supportive and a set where one expects that one is going to have a mind-opening experience, plus good guidance and a warm and supportive setting, the likelihood of having a very positive, very insightful, very beautiful experience is very high. If it is given to you, say, in a hospital where you are surrounded by doctors who think you are going crazy and who interpret your behavior that way, that is a very powerful influence on the nature of the experience. Because if you have something happen to you that you have never had happen before, you reach for a label or a category or some way to handle this thing. And what we found was that as people use this, having different labels, they had different experiences, right? So that it is true that people have reported as varied experiences as one could imagine from any single chemical. And we can pretty well now define that these various experiences are a function of, as I say, the preparation and the environment in which they have the experience. As far as what lies behind these experiences, physiologically or psychologically, we are in a very, very primitive stage of our understanding of how the brain works. Most of the theories that we have, we've discounted. I'm not talking about me now. I'm talking about neurophysiologists and so on. Perhaps the best theory that accounts for what's happening concerns the use of a chemical called serotonin, which occurs naturally in the brain. You could think of it almost in lay terms as a brain lubricant, if you will. The brain has a series of neurons or nerve fibers that meet at what are little chemical bonds or bubbles called synapses. And one fiber may come into a synapse, and maybe 5 fibers will go out, anywhere from 5 to maybe 10,000 fibers will go out of one of these synapses. Now, learning means that one input fiber gets associated with one output fiber. This is like a chemical link, right? So that every time the input fires, the output occurs. So if I say black, you might say white, or mother, father, and these are highly probable associations. Now, when you change the chemical balance of that little bubble, that changes the likelihood of any specific neuron firing. So that what you may end up with is an input fiber occurring and all of the possible outputs occurring simultaneously, right? In other words, rather than just when, say, the stimulus mother comes in, just one particular association, you might have 500 associations to that. Now, what is so awesome about the state, the experiential, the subjective experience with the psychedelics, is that you are able to process all of that data simultaneously. Now, that stops all of us, because usually we think at the rate of about 3 concepts a second. Right? And that's how long it takes us to think a thought and conceptualize it. Now, if you will go back to what you must have been like as an infant, when you didn't see sofa, chair, woman, man, so on, all you saw were color and form. You didn't go through the conceptual process. You merely took in a whole experiential mass, which included your body, included all of your senses acting on you at once. And you process, you handle all that data. It's only when you go to, if you will, conceptualize it, that you slow down, right? Well, apparently, psychologically, what is happening here is that you are bypassing that component of your brain which is concerned with conceptualization, which we have called our mind, all right? And that's why we have gotten the sort of semi-facetious comment, you have to go out of your mind to use your head. The brain has some 90% of what is called silent area. That is, neurophysiologists haven't found out any particular electrical activity or use for it. Mm-hmm. And there is an argument that as very small children, we develop, through learning, a certain conceptual framework that we are taught for organizing our world. And this framework is adequate. It gets us through life. And it might have, say, 10,000 concepts in it, or maybe 50,000. That is compared to a possibility of, well, we have something like 13 billion cells in our brain. And every one of these has a possibility of 25,000 associations. So the potentiality of the brain compared to what we use is a staggering differential. It's like having a huge computer into which you're putting a program to add and subtract very simple numbers, you know. Now, what happens is, as a child, you develop a conceptual framework, and then, from then on, all you do is really add things onto that, but you never alter that basic conceptual framework. So that you're really dealing with kind of an old picture you've taken that is very far removed from the here and now, so that if I see something new, I relate it back to that conceptual framework I have. I have a set of little categories, and if it fits into one of them, or the one it most closely fits into is the one I deal with it with. And that's usually adequate. But it's far beneath what the potentiality of the brain is all about. So we've looked around for a psychological theory that would best explain what we think is going on with this. And the best one we've come up with is one called imprinting and re-imprinting. Most of the imprinting research has been done with animals. And to give you an example, if you take a duckling, a baby duckling, and between 12 and 20 hours after birth, I think for the duckling, it may be different, that may be for the chick, I'm not sure. The duckling, if the mother passes in front of the duckling will follow the mother. It's called a following response. It's a built-in response mechanism, and it's elicited by the stimulus of this large moving object, this mother, all right? Well, now, at that period of time, if you separated the babies from the mother and instead put the example we use, a large orange basketball, all right, and rolled that in front of the babies, after 20 hours, the babies would follow orange basketballs. Furthermore, from then on, if you then put them in a choice situation, which is called a Y maze, where the baby is here on the base of the Y, and then the orange basketball's on one side and the mother is on the other, instead of following the big, soft, furry mother, those that have been imprinted to the orange basketball will choose the basketball over the mother, right, from then onward. Right? In other words, once the picture is taken, that's what they're left with. Right? Now, we have a whole range of animal experiments showing this imprinting at certain periods in development, which are called critical periods. Okay? And thus far, research, until recently, has been unable to devise methods of modifying that process either slowing it down or actually altering an imprint that's been formed. Now, we haven't found formally human imprinting process. There are theories that something goes on between the 6th and the 11th month in child development that looks a lot like the forming of a relationship to the external environment you could think of in imprinting terms. But if we take the animal metaphor and apply it to humans, which is, after all, what any theory is, it's merely a metaphor to describe observational data, you could argue that we as humans develop a series of imprints or photographs. It's as if your brain was a movie camera that at some point in its development took a picture, took a photograph. And then that's the photograph you have in your album. And from then on, for example, you took a photograph of woman, and then from then on, all women are related to that photograph of woman. Now imagine that chemically you were able to take the brain and open it up all over again, right? Not that you wipe out the original conceptual formulation, but you get to a point where you see that as only one possible way of formulating the world. In other words, you see that as only one possible picture album, and you were actually able to alter the chemical state of your brain so that you could take new pictures. In other words, you could chemically open up the whole situation all over again, so that you could take what Aldous Huxley calls sort of here and now photographs. In other words, you could see the world afresh as it really is, not as you're seeing it through your whole history, right? So that the whole burden of your history isn't carried with you from day to day. At this point, you stop and you get a whole fresh picture, right? So that's a psychological theory for what's going on, and we've been playing with this whole concept of imprinting and programming or planning for imprinting. In other words, if you were going to take new pictures, which ones would you take, and how would you take them? In other words, rather than leaving it up to chance what pictures you take in a session, you plan it by programming or preparing for the sessions. Well, that's a whole other topic.
One of mankind's oldest activities has been to search for substances that alter the mind in various ways, and for many reasons. To ease pain, to alter the mood of day-to-day living, to expand the limits of the mind. Depending on the social attitudes of the time, the pioneers in this field have been condemned or condoned. Experiments have been conducted over many centuries, and our ancestors have at one time or other nibbled, chewed, drank, sipped, and otherwise consumed substances that have had profound effects on the mind. Whether these substances have been plants and roots, alcohol, or narcotic barbiturates, one of the very real problems has been the danger of addiction. What are the possibilities of physiological or psychological addiction to the psychedelic compounds in use today?
The World Medical News, which is an organ of the American Medical Association, said in the spring of 1963, as far as everybody was concerned, there were no physical side effects. Now, then we come to the psychological effects, right? And here it seems, again, to be a function of the set and setting, whether a person will have a negative experience or not. Now, following a negative experience, a person could have a depression for a period of time, could be disoriented for a period of time. And then you can ask the question, if you have had the most profound experience of your life, mightn't you be disoriented for a little while until you fit it all into place? And that's why we were interested in having that moratorium, that period where a person could go around and re-look at the whole universe before settling back into any single groove. Now, some people, for example, do change. Like a minister may look and then decide to stop being a minister, right? Well, now, to the community and to his family, this is a bad thing. To him, it might be the greatest freeing experience of his life. Just like a criminal may decide to stop being a criminal. Well, society thinks that's great, you see. But in other words, change they want and yet they don't want. You see, this is a bit of a problem. In our own research, we have over some 3,000 ingestions that have been involved in our research. And none of our subjects that we ever had in our experiments are presently in hospitals, or have they committed suicide, or have there been any really negative effect that I can see.
By the fall of 1962, The Harvard experiments had progressed to the point where more than 3,500 doses of the compound psilocybin had been dispensed to some 400 volunteers. They included doctors, artists, poets, writers, graduate students, and ministers of many faiths. Alpert and Leary reported that 73% of their subjects had very pleasant experiences, while 95% said it changed their lives for the better. In the course of this experimentation, it was discovered that the most important factor in an actual session is an informal and relaxed environment. Prior to the Harvard experiments, work had been done with psilocybin at Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Concord using volunteer inmates. This program was carried on for 2 years, and enthusiastic reports accompanied these experiments.
Now, these were maximum security offenders, very tough guys. In fact, they were the toughest guys in the prison because they were all volunteers, and it was a big status thing to get into a drug project in a prison. I mean, you imagine being sent to prison and then people are going to turn you on with drugs. And that project was designed to see whether or not we could change the recidivism rate, that is, the percentage of prisoners that would go back to prison when they got out. Originally, at that prison, the baseline is something like 70% of these guys are back in a year after they get out. And we were curious to see whether we could reduce that. And with our sample, which was small, and we were stopped in that project, the percentage of prisoners is something like 34% that went back. Now, you don't know what happened to the other 40. Either maybe they got so smart that they're better criminals.
Psilocybin experiments were also conducted with theology students at the Harvard Divinity School in cooperation with a doctor of medicine studying for a doctorate in divinity. What occurred during these experiments, and what are some additional social implications of psychedelic compounds?
He went through the literature, and he found some 9 independent criteria of what was a genuine mystical religious experience in the Christian literature. And then he set these aside, and then he took 20 theological students, and on Good Friday in the Boston University Chapel, he ran a study in which 10 of the 20 were given psilocybin, and 10 of them were given a placebo.
Neutral.
Something that affected them, their skin a little bit, and made them think something was happening, but indeed was not a psychedelic compound. Then, following the experiment, the service, they all recorded, when they were able, their experiences. And then independent judges rated these experiences for how many of these 9 religious criteria were present in the experiences. And of the experimental group, 9 out of 10 had at least 4 of the 9 criteria, while of the control group, 1 out of 10 had 1 of the 9 criteria, which is a very significant difference. In other words, many of these guys were reporting a genuine mystical religious experience. So in that sense, the subjects were theological students. In other studies where you're studying creativity, the subjects would be artists and musicians and writers. If you're studying the relationship, how it works in marriages, where it's a fantastically interesting thing of opening up a whole marriage all over again so that it's as if it's a remarriage each time, where people see one another in an entirely fresh and new way. Then you want to use married couples. If you're going to work with addicts, you want addicts. So it's really been selected on the basis of the studies that have been carried out.
As the experiments continued, Alpert, Leary, and Metzner became the subject of mounting criticism. Consequently, in November of 1962, they were released from the Harvard staff.
It's really impossible for any existing institution to provide an umbrella for something as profoundly altering as this kind of experience. Let me show you some of the problems that arose. We were in a wing of the Social Relations Department called the Center for Research and Personality, and there were, say, 9 professors in there. And each year we would get in 15 new graduate students. Right? Well, now, when we were doing that research with psychedelics, usually the graduate students are allotted to the faculty members, so each one gets so many of them as their research assistants. That's the way the game worked. Well, we ran into the problem where 3 months after we had begun, in 1 year, 12 of the 15 had joined our project. In other words, it was so powerful, it was so enticing and so intriguing to people, and it was so upsetting to the existing models that we had going in psychology. It raised all new questions, and as our boss once said to us, I don't care if you could make all the graduate students Buddha. We are here to train clinical psychologists. And in fact, he was right. I mean, we were playing tennis on the football field, if you will. You know, we were into a much more profound type of stuff than could be handled within any kind of liberal arts institution. Now, furthermore, drugs and drug research are very, very taboo topics in our culture because our culture has only two models for the use of drugs. Either you're sick and you take drugs to get well, or for kicks, right? And we said, well, doesn't have anything to do with either of those. The people that are using it aren't sick. They're taking it for growth, for education, for exploration, maybe for religious purposes, for creativity. Well, there wasn't any existing framework for anybody to really understand this at all. And the history of all this, it's the same thing that happened to hypnosis in Yale in the 30s and to nitrous oxide research way back. It scared everybody. They just didn't know how to handle it. So it was very apparent that we had to separate the research from Harvard, which we did very amicably. At first, we set up IFIF and separated it out. But still, we were on the faculty at Harvard, and in some sense, Harvard continued to be identified with this. And this wasn't going to work, so it became apparent we had to leave. You know, we had to go. And the technical reason for my being fired was for the administration of the chemical to an undergraduate. Right? Now, actually, our research was not designed for undergraduates. In fact, it was designed primarily for people like prisoners and ministers and artists and some graduate students and so on. And we were not interested in undergraduates at all. And this was more like a special case of a kid who had had experience with these chemicals before, was over 21, had his parents' consent and so on. But technically, it was grounds for the university to fire me.